You watched Brazil host the 2014 World Cup and then collapse into the worst recession in its recorded history within 18 months. You saw Lula, one of the most popular leaders on earth, end his first 2 terms with 80% approval ratings, and then watch his country elect his polar opposite. You noticed that Brazil refused to send weapons to Ukraine, authorized Iranian naval vessels to dock in its ports, joined OPEC Plus while simultaneously hosting COP30, and still got invited to every table that matters. You saw a country that controls 12% of the world's fresh water, 60% of the Amazon basin, the largest deepwater oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere, and more arable land than any nation on Earth, and yet ranks 84th on the Human Development Index. You noticed that Brazil's economy, the 9th largest in the world by nominal GDP, has not broken into the top 6 since 2011. You noticed that a country the size of a continent keeps producing moments of arrival that never quite arrive. The pattern you've been sensing is real. And it has a name, a structure, and a history longer than you might expect. The conventional explanation is political dysfunction, corruption, instability, short-termism. That explanation is not wrong. It is just radically incomplete. What it misses is the deeper logic, why those pathologies persist, why they cannot be reformed away by any single administration, and why Brazil's enormous assets have, through a precise and repeatable mechanism, continually undermined rather than compounded one another. Beneath the surface of every Brazilian political crisis, a single structural dynamic is operating. It was built into the country before it had a name. It has outlasted every government, every ideology, every commodity boom, and every round of international attention. Until you understand that dynamic, you are watching symptoms and calling them causes. Start with the land. The Portuguese crown distributed Brazil in the 16th century through a system called sesmarias, enormous land grants given to loyal nobles with the explicit mandate to extract wealth, not build institutions. These were not settlements. They were extraction machines. The grantee owed the crown a fraction of output. Everyone else owed the grantee everything. The system created a society organized not around accumulation, investment, or the rule of law, but around hierarchy and tribute. That design persisted. Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James A. Robinson, in their landmark 2001 paper in the American Economic Review, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, demonstrated that the type of institution a colonizer built, extractive versus inclusive, is the single most powerful predictor of a country's income per capita today. Brazil received extractive institutions of the most concentrated form, plantation slavery, land monopoly, and a state whose function was to protect elite wealth rather than broadly distribute opportunity. The Portuguese crown abolished the sesmarias system in 1822. The land genie, the measure of land concentration inequality, barely moved. A 2025 analysis drawing on 1920 census data found average land Gini coefficients of 0.85 to 0.87 across Brazil's major states. That number, if you have not encountered it before, means land is distributed with more inequality than almost any other resource in any comparable society. The physical fact of who owns the land in Brazil today traces almost directly to who received a royal grant 5 centuries ago. This is what Acemoglu and Robinson mean by institutional persistence. It is not metaphorical. It is measurable. And it is the foundation on which every other structural problem in Brazil is built. Brazilian economists, business leaders, and policymakers have a term for what this institutional inheritance costs in practice. They call it Custo Brasil, the Brazil cost. It refers to the total burden of doing business in a country where bureaucracy, taxation, labor regulation, and infrastructure deficit combine to make every transaction more expensive than it would be anywhere comparable. The number, by current estimates, is over 1.5 trillion reais drained from the Brazilian economy annually. A 2022 INSET analysis found that Custo Brasil accounts for approximately 22% of GDP in lost efficiency. Only 18% of Brazil's roads are paved, roughly half the global average for a country at its income level. Navigating the tax code requires, on average, 1,501 hours per year for a business to comply, the highest of any large economy in the world. This is the mechanism beneath the surface. Brazil does not lack resources. It lacks the capacity to convert resources into compounding economic power, because every conversion is taxed, not just formally, but structurally, by institutions that were not designed to distribute gains broadly. The Harvard Business School case, Brazil's Enigma, Sustaining Long-Term Growth, produced by Laura Alfaro in 2012, captured the paradox precisely. GDP growth hit 7.5% in 2010, and yet Custo Brasil was simultaneously gutting domestic manufacturing, because the very boom that produced growth also made the structural problems more expensive to carry. In 2007, Brazilian engineers confirmed the existence of the pre-salt oil fields, reserves buried beneath 7,000 meters of ocean floor, rock, sand, and a thick crust of Atlantic salt. President Lula donned overalls and helicoptered to an offshore platform to dip his hand in the crude. God is Brazilian, his chief of staff Dilma Rousseff announced at a government seminar. The pre-salt layer stretches across 149,000 square kilometers, an area half the size of Italy, and may contain up to 80 billion barrels of light, sweet crude, the most valuable grade of oil on the market. What happened next is textbook. Economists call it Dutch disease, after the affliction that struck the Netherlands in the 1960s when a North Sea natural gas bonanza flooded the Dutch economy with foreign currency, inflated the value of the guilder, and systematically destroyed Dutch export manufacturing. The mechanism, formally modeled by Corden and Neary in their 1982 analysis, operates in two stages. First, labor migrates from manufacturing to the resource sector. Then, the resource windfall raises domestic demand and the real exchange rate, making everything the country produces more expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Brazilian economists Brescia Pereira and Marconi documented exactly this pattern in their 2008 analysis. Between 1992 and 2007, long before the pre-salt confirmation, Brazil's trade balance was already shifting toward commodities and away from industrial goods. The pre-salt discovery accelerated what was already underway. The country with more arable land than anyone, more freshwater than anyone, and now more offshore oil than anyone was, through the logic of resource abundance itself, being structurally pushed away from the complex, high-value manufacturing and services that actually compound into geopolitical power. A country that sells soybeans and crude oil is valuable. It is not powerful. Power requires the capacity to produce what others cannot easily replace: aircraft, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, weapons systems, financial instruments. Brazil's commodity wealth, channeled through Custo Brasil institutions that cannot efficiently redirect it into industrial capacity, has been producing the permanent appearance of a country on the verge of something it never quite reaches. This pattern has a precise precedent. It is not Brazil's alone. Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries received, through its American colonies, the largest influx of silver in the history of the world. The Potosí mines in what is now Bolivia were, at peak production, extracting roughly 60% of global silver supply. Madrid became the richest city in Europe. And then Spanish manufacturing collapsed, because the silver made imports cheaper than domestic production, the real exchange rate soared, and the productive base that might have compounded the windfall into sustained power was hollowed out instead. The historian J.H. Eliot, in Imperial Spain, 1469 to 1716, 1963, documented how the Spanish crown used American silver to fund wars, pay debts, and sustain an imperial posture, rather than invest in the institutions and industries that would have made Spain self-sustaining. By 1700, Spain was still militarily present across Europe but economically dependent on the very colonial system it had built. The resource had not built the power. The resource had substituted for it. Brazil in the 21st century is not Spain in the 17th. But the structural logic is the same. A country that can extract and export primary commodities does not automatically develop the institutional complexity, the manufacturing base, or the technological capacity that converts material wealth into durable geopolitical weight. The windfall and the capability gap can coexist, and coexisting, can reinforce each other for generations. You watched Brazil at the 2024 G20, which it hosted. You watched Lula propose a Ukraine peace plan and pitch it directly to Zelensky and Putin. You saw Brazil refuse to ban Huawei, not once, but through a pattern of deliberate delay, postponing its 5G auction from March 2020 until 2021, buying time rather than choosing a side. You noticed that Brazil joined BRICS, joined OPEC+, maintained its relationship with Washington, deepened its trade relationship with Beijing, now the dominant destination for Brazilian exports, and simultaneously positioned itself as the host of the most significant climate summit in years. This is not incoherence. It is a doctrine. The foreign policy community in Brasilia calls it politica externa ativa e altiva, active and assertive foreign policy, a phrase attributed to Celso Amorim, Lula's foreign policy architect, and rooted in an intellectual tradition documented by the Brazilian diplomatic historian Amado Servo in his 2007 work on Brazilian foreign policy. The core premise, traced through Servo's analysis and confirmed by Lula's own statements, is that Brazil's two permanent foreign policy drivers are development and autonomy, and that these goals can only be achieved by refusing alignment with any single great power. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, in a December 2023 analysis, described this as a desire for a multipolar order where states its size have more say in international institutions. The Belfer Center at Harvard, in a 2025 study of Brazil's navigation between Washington and Beijing, identified the Huawei delay as a precise case study in what they called Brazil's strategic deferral, the systematic use of postponement to preserve optionality in a world that increasingly demands alignment. The logic is coherent. A country that chooses Washington over Beijing loses its largest trading partner. A country that chooses Beijing over Washington loses access to Western financial markets, NATO security guarantees, and U.S. diplomatic support at the institutions that still set the global rules. Brazil, by refusing to choose, preserves access to both. The cost is the inability to secure the alliance relationships that have historically accelerated great power emergence. Japan's post-war rise was underwritten by Washington's security guarantee. South Korea's industrial transformation was funded partly by U.S. military expenditure. Germany's reintegration into the global economy was structured by NATO membership. Brazil has deliberately refused all of those accelerants, and it has done so for principled strategic reasons, not through naivety. Here is the deeper structural problem with Brazil's foreign policy autonomy doctrine: it is not just a choice between options. It reflects a genuine strategic trap. Kenneth Waltz, in Theory of International Politics, 1979, identified the security dilemma as a structural condition in which the actions a state takes to increase its own security necessarily decrease the security of its neighbors and rivals, producing a spiral of responses that leaves everyone worse off. Brazil does not face a conventional security dilemma with its neighbors. It borders 11 weaker states, most of them former Spanish colonies with significantly smaller economies, and faces no plausible military challenge from any of them. Brazil's security dilemma is economic and institutional. The moment Brazil aligns firmly with one great power, it becomes a dependency rather than a partner, and its leverage, which currently derives precisely from its non-alignment, disappears. The moment it fully asserts regional leadership, it generates resistance from the neighbors it needs as partners for the regional integration that would give it genuine continental weight. Brazil's size and power, relative to South America, are so disproportionate that any strong assertion of leadership reads, to Buenos Aires or Bogotá, as hegemony. And so Brazil consistently pulls back from the regional integration that might actually convert its continental geography into political authority. This dynamic, the superpower candidate whose very size prevents the alliance building that superpower status requires, has one close historical parallel: Germany before 1914. The historian A.J.P. Taylor, in The Struggle for Mastery in Europe, 1954, identified Germany's central continental position as both its greatest strategic asset and its greatest structural vulnerability, powerful enough to threaten everyone, not powerful enough to deter them all simultaneously. Brazil's position in South America is not militarized in the same way. But the structural logic, the country too large to be ignored, too dominant to be trusted, too consequential to be isolated, operates with recognizable force. Brazil's domestic political history compounds every structural problem. You watched Lula win in 2002, govern through the commodity boom, and leave with approval ratings that no democratic leader in the Western Hemisphere has matched in the modern era. You watched Dilma Rousseff, his chosen successor, win in 2010, preside over economic collapse, and get impeached in 2016. You watched Michel Temer govern through emergency austerity. You watched Jair Bolsonaro win in 2018, deliberately dismantle Brazil's regional foreign policy, cultivate Washington while antagonizing Beijing, and lose in 2022 to the same Lula he had displaced. You watched Lula return, announce a new industrial policy, host the G20, and begin COP30 preparations, while Bolsonaro supporters' January 8, 2023 attack on government buildings was still being adjudicated. The pattern you're watching is not mere volatility. It is a structural feature of a political system that has never resolved its foundational tension, the extractive elite that controls land, credit, and institutional access versus a majority population that depends on state redistribution to access what the market will not distribute to them. Every Lula administration governs on behalf of redistribution. Every subsequent administration is, in part, a reassertion of elite prerogative. No reform lasts long enough to compound. No industrial policy runs its full cycle before the next administration dismantles it. What economists call policy credibility, the confidence of investors and institutions that commitments will be honored across governments, is permanently degraded by this oscillation. The political scientist Francis Fukuyama, in Political Order and Political Decay, 2014, identifies state capacity, rule of law, and democratic accountability as the three legs of sustainable political development, and argues that countries without all three are trapped in cyclical instability. Brazil has democratic accountability. It has nominal rule of law. What it has never fully developed is the state capacity to implement policy independent of the political cycle, because the institutions through which policy is implemented are themselves penetrated by the elite networks whose interests policy is supposed to discipline. The Lava Jato, car wash, investigation that began in 2014 exposed the precise mechanism. Petrobras, the state energy company that was supposed to convert the pre-salt windfall into national industrial capacity, had been used as a patronage machine for nearly every major political party. The construction firms building Brazil's infrastructure were simultaneously funding the campaigns of the politicians who awarded the contracts. When Lava Jato prosecutors began dismantling those networks, they also dismantled Brazil's investment capacity, Petrobras's debt burden tripled, infrastructure projects froze, and the commodity-dependent economy lost the institutional anchor that was supposed to diversify it. Here is the conceptual tool that makes sense of what looks like a string of missed opportunities. The political scientist Mancur Olson, in The Rise and Decline of Nations, 1982, developed what he called the logic of collective action applied to national economies. Over time, in stable political systems, narrow interest groups, what Olson called distributional coalitions, organize, capture institutions, and impose costs on the broader economy in order to protect their specific advantages. These coalitions do not need to be corrupt in the obvious sense. They simply need to be organized enough to block reforms that would benefit the diffuse majority at the expense of the concentrated minority. Brazil has been producing Olsonian distributional coalitions since the Sesmarias grants of the 16th century. The landowners who resisted agrarian reform under Getulio Vargas in the 1930s. The industrialists who lobbied for the import substitution walls that protected inefficient domestic production from the 1950s through the 1980s. The political class that embedded patronage networks inside Petrobras, the National Development Bank BNDES, and every major state institution. These are not separate problems. They are the same problem at different scales and different historical moments. The reason Brazil has everything it needs and has not yet converted that into superpower capacity is that its institutions were designed, and have been repeatedly redesigned, to protect the wealth of those who already hold it, rather than to build the compounding capabilities that great power emergence requires. You are watching Brazil in a moment of genuine structural inflection, the first in decades that has real material weight behind it. The energy transition is revaluing exactly what Brazil has in surplus. The green energy economy requires lithium, nickel, rare earths, agricultural land for biofuels, and freshwater. Brazil has dominant global positions in most of these. China's investment in Brazilian solar manufacturing and lithium mining, documented by the Belfer Center's 2025 analysis, is not charity. It is strategic repositioning by Beijing for a world in which Brazil's resource advantage will be more valuable, not less. The COP30 host role gives Brazil diplomatic authority it has not held since the 1992 Earth Summit, also hosted in Rio de Janeiro, also a moment that produced institutional ambition without lasting structural change. Whether this iteration produces something different depends on whether Lula's administration can align the foreign policy ambition with domestic institutional reform in a way that outlasts this particular government. The structural argument says it probably will not. Not because of bad intentions, but because the extractive institutional architecture, documented by Acemoglu and Robinson in its colonial origins, reinforced by the Custo Brasil mechanism, accelerated by Dutch disease dynamics in the resource sector, and perpetuated by Olsonian distributional coalitions in the political class, is not dismantled by a single administration or a single commodity cycle. It requires the kind of sustained, cross-coalition reform that Brazil's political pendulum has, so far, not allowed to run. The next time you watch a Brazilian moment, a boom, a scandal, a new industrial policy announcement, a foreign policy pivot, a corruption investigation, you now have the structural layer beneath the event. Brazil is not a country that keeps making mistakes. It is a country whose institutions were built to produce specific outcomes, and they produce those outcomes with remarkable consistency. Resource wealth flows upward and outward rather than converting into industrial capacity. Political coalitions form to capture state institutions rather than reform them. Foreign policy oscillates between autonomy and alignment, maintaining optionality at the cost of the alliance relationships that accelerate power projection. The country of the future is a phrase Brazilians have been using about themselves since at least the 1940s. The Brazilian modernist writer and anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro, cited repeatedly in Brazilian public discourse, put it more precisely: Brazil is not the country of the future. Brazil is the country of delayed decisions. What the structural analysis adds to Ribeiro's formulation is precision about why the decisions keep getting delayed, and who benefits from the delay. Brazil has everything it needs. The question is not whether it has the resources. The question is whether it will build the institutions capable of converting those resources into the compounding power that superpowers actually require. The structural answer, drawn from 5 centuries of institutional persistence, is that this conversion cannot happen through resource discovery, foreign investment, or diplomatic positioning alone. It requires institutional redesign of a depth that no Brazilian government has yet been able to sustain across a full political cycle. That is what you are actually watching every time Brazil appears in the news. Not a country failing. A country operating exactly as its institutions were designed to operate, and straining, in every generation, against those designs. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.